All right, ready to dive in. Today, we're tackling one of the biggest mysteries in American history, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
And you sent us some really interesting sources this time.
Yeah, we've got articles from the third decade and excerpts from Lansky and Contract on America, too,
So our mission, if you choose to accept it,
is to uncover the most fascinating and insightful stuff these sources have to offer about the JFK assassination.
what keeps people coming back to this, even decades later? New theories keep popping up.
Right, and we're going to cover a lot. Science, history, and even a little peek into organized crime.
Should be fun.
First up, let's talk about this article, The Laws of Physics and the Assassination of President Kennedy by Robert B. O'Rourke. It's from the third decade, and it digs into the science behind the assassination.
Yeah.
The single bullet theory.
Yeah, the one that says a single bullet hit both President Kennedy and Governor Connolly.
But one of the biggest things people bring up is how President Kennedy's head snaps backward in the Zapruder film. That seems impossible if the shot came from behind.
Exactly.
And this is where the article gets interesting. It talks about Dr. Luis Alvarez's jet effect theory.
Alvarez was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He actually tried to explain how a bullet could cause that backward head snap.
So what did he come up with?
Well, his theory is that the bullet, when it exited, created a jet of material. Think bone fragments, brain matter, things like that.
Oh, yeah.
And this jet basically propelled the head backward, almost like, like a rocket.
Oh, interesting.
He even did an experiment to see if this would work, fired a bullet into a melon to simulate the impact.
Wait, a melon? Really?
Yeah. I mean, it was a way to visualize what might have happened, but there are some issues with using a melon as a stand-in for a human head.
Yeah, I can see that.
For one, it doesn't have the same structure as a human skull. And on top of that, Alvarez used a soft-nosed bullet, which is different from the one that supposedly killed Kennedy. So there are inconsistencies.
So maybe not the most accurate experiment, but what does this whole jet effect theory mean when we're trying to understand the assassination?
Well, it challenges the simple explanation of the single bullet theory. If this jet effect caused the head snap, there would have been a lot of brain matter ejected forward. And that wasn't mentioned in the autopsy report.
Oh, wow. So that's a big problem for the official narrative.
It is. And this article also introduces another theory, the two-collision effect.
Oh, what's that one?
Well, O'Rourke, the author, suggests that the bullet might have hit the skull first.
Okay.
And then the skull, moving forward, could have impacted the brain, causing that backward head snap.
So instead of the jet pushing the head back, it's the skull hitting the brain.
Exactly. But again, you'd need a lot of brain matter to be ejected for this to work. And as we said, that wasn't reported.
It's fascinating how even the physics of this event are still debated. So much for a settled case.
Right. It's anything but settled.
Let's move on to another intriguing article from the third decade, Oswald's Raleigh call, the phone call that Meyer was, by Grover B. Proctor, Jr. This one focuses on a strange phone call Oswald tried to make from jail the night before he was killed.
Yeah. That phone call seems like a small detail, but it leads to all sorts of questions.
Right, so Oswald supposedly tried to call this guy, John Hurt, in Raleigh, North Carolina. But the call never connected. And guess why?
Why?
A telephone operator, Mrs. Alveda Treon, saw two men, probably Secret Service agents, monitoring the switchboard and blocking the call.
Interesting.
What makes it even stranger is that Mrs. Treon kept the phone slip with two numbers on it, both for John Hurt and Raleigh. And you know what? Even though some people said those numbers were unlisted, they were actually in the phone book.
Really?
Yeah.
That seems like a big mistake, if it was a mistake at all.
Right. Was someone trying to hide something about this call?
Possibly. The author of the article actually tracked down one of those John Hurts. He was a former Army counterintelligence officer, and he said he didn't know Oswald and had no idea why Oswald would call him.
So we've got a blocked call, maybe to an intelligence officer, and Oswald was already under a microscope. What does it all mean?
It definitely makes you question the lone gunman theory. Could this call have been Oswald trying to reach a handler? Was he part of something bigger?
The article doesn't give a definitive answer, but it raises some really compelling possibilities. Could this John Hurt have been what's called a cutout?
A cutout? You mean like a middleman in espionage?
Yeah, exactly. Someone who passes messages around and helps keep things, deniable.
I see.
So if Oswald was trying to reach his handler through this John Hurt, that suggests a level of organization and planning that goes way beyond a lone gunman.
Absolutely.
And the fact that the call was blocked just adds another layer of intrigue to this whole thing.
Right, like someone didn't want Oswald talking to whoever he was trying to reach. And big names in assassination research have pointed to this as a key piece of evidence. People like Anthony Summers, G. Robert Blakey, Victor Marchetti.
It's kind of crazy to think a simple phone call could hold such important clues to this whole event.
It shows how important it is to pay attention to even the smallest details. Sometimes that's where you find the most revealing information.
Well, we've uncovered some really fascinating stuff so far, and we're just getting started. Next up, we'll look at an article about the FBI's influence within the CIA, which raises even more questions about the forces at play behind the assassination.
Sounds interesting. Speaking of shadowy figures, let's move on to another interesting article from the third decade. It's called Stray Shots 2, Lansky's Gun by Scott Van Winsberg. And this one takes us into the world of interagency rivalries, between the FBI and the CIA.
Oh, juicy. I've always been fascinated by the whole FBI-CIA dynamic. What's the scoop?
Well, it focuses on something a lot of people don't know about the early CIA. A lot of former FBI agents ended up in key positions there.
Really?
Yeah. And the article suggests that J. Edgar Hoover, the head honcho of the FBI,
Yeah.
he actually orchestrated this like a way to keep tabs on his rival organization.
So Hoover was basically planting his people in the CIA. That's wild. Why would he do that?
Well, Hoover and the FBI, they saw the CIA as a threat, to their power, their influence.
Right.
By putting ex-FBI agents in the CIA, Hoover could, control information, maybe even influence what the CIA did.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
The article mentions a couple of those guys, right? Winston Scott and William King Harvey.
Yep.
I vaguely remember those names. Remind me who they were and why they matter.
Okay, so both Scott and Harvey held pretty important positions in the CIA, especially in covert operations.
Mm-hmm.
Scott was the CIA's chief of station in Mexico City, which was a pretty important place in the lead up to the assassination. And Harvey was deeply involved in the CIA's plots to kill Fidel Castro.
So they weren't just low-level guys. They were major players. And their FBI background. That just raises all sorts of questions about what they might have been up to, especially when it comes to Kennedy.
Yeah, for sure. Did their FBI ties influence their decisions? Were they acting on their own, or were they taking orders from someone higher up, maybe even Hoover himself? We don't know.
It's a tangled web, that's for sure. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in guys like Robert Maheu and Guy Bannister, both former FBI, both connected to the CIA, and maybe even to Oswald.
Right. Maheu worked for Howard Hughes after he left the FBI. The CIA even tried to get him to recruit mafia guys for a plot to kill Castro. And then there's Bannister, another ex-FBI agent. He had connections to the CIA and maybe even to Oswald.
Man, it's like everyone in this story has some link to the FBI or the CIA. It's hard to believe Oswald was just some lone gunman with no connections.
Yeah, the article really makes you think about the FBI's influence, their way of thinking, and their connections within the CIA. Did all that play a role in what happened in Dallas? It's a question worth asking.
Definitely. The whole FBI-CIA angle adds another layer to this whole thing. It's crazy.
It really is. And as we dig deeper into these sources, we'll see how all these threads start to come together. Power, secrecy, potential deception, it's all there.
Well, before my head explodes, let's switch gears for a bit and talk about organized crime and the JFK assassination. I'm really curious about what Lansky and Contract on America have to say about that.
Ah, yes, the mafia, always a crowd pleaser. These books offer some really interesting insights into why key figures in organized crime might have wanted Kennedy gone and how they operated.
Let's start with Meyer Lansky, one of the biggest names in organized crime. He basically ran a criminal empire. How does he fit into all of this?
Well, to understand Lansky's motive, I'll look at Cuba. Lansky had poured a ton of money into casinos there. They were doing great under Batista. But when Castro came to power, he shut them all down. Lansky lost a fortune.
Ouch. So Castro coming to power was a big hit to Lansky's wallet. I can see why he wouldn't be a fan. But how does this tie into the assassination?
Well, the Kennedy administration was trying to get rid of Castro, remember? The Bay of Pigs invasion.
Yeah.
That was a disaster. And it seems that Lansky, who some say helped the Kennedys financially, felt like they betrayed him.
So Kennedy not only failed to get rid of Castro, but he might have also alienated a powerful figure in organized crime. That's not good.
Nope, not at all. And while there's no direct proof that Lansky was involved in the assassination, there are some intriguing links to others who might have been.
Like Carlos Marcello. Contract on America points to him as a major player in the assassination, and Lansky talks about how close he was to Lansky.
Exactly. Marcello was a big-time mafia boss in New Orleans. And Messick, the author of Lansky, even suggests that Marcello was a frontman for Lansky, shielding him, while still carrying out his plans.
So if Marcello was involved and he was tight with Lansky, it's not crazy to think that Lansky knew about the plot to kill Kennedy, or even helped plan it.
It's a compelling theory. It fits with what we know about Lansky. The guy was ruthless, and he wanted his Cuban empire back.
It's chilling to think that organized crime might have had the power to pull this off to kill a president. But as we've seen in this deep dive, things are rarely as simple as they seem. And the Kennedy assassination is a prime example of how power, greed, and betrayal can lead to tragedy.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll see how all these threads we've talked about, the physics, the phone call, the FBI-CIA connection, and the mafia, they all point to something much bigger and more complex than the official story.
Man, this deep dive into the JFK assassination has been a wild ride. These sources really paint a different picture than the lone gunman story we usually hear.
Yeah, you really start to see things differently when you look at it from all these angles. The physics, the phone call, the FBI and CIA connections, and then organized crime. It's hard not to think there was something bigger going on.
Right. It's like Lee Harvey Oswald, the supposed lone gunman, almost disappears. He's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Exactly. And if we think about that blocked phone call, the possibility that Oswald had connections to intelligence agencies, well, his role in everything takes on a whole new meaning. What if he was just a patsy, someone set up to take the fall?
And if the real masterminds were people in the CIA, the FBI, or even organized crime, that's seriously messed up. It makes you question who's really in charge and how far they'll go to protect themselves.
It raises some uncomfortable questions about power and corruption, that's for sure. The Kennedy assassination, it's not a closed case. It's still an open wound, and people are still searching for the truth.
It's like trying to put a puzzle together, but we're missing some pieces. We don't have the full picture yet, but we're starting to see a pattern.
And that's what makes this kind of deep dive so important. We're not saying we have all the answers. It's about getting you to think critically and come to your own conclusions based on what we found.
So, what's the takeaway here? The John F. Kennedy assassination is still a mystery, and it's one that keeps people coming back for more, trying to find answers.
It shows that history isn't always what it seems, and the search for justice never really ends.
We encourage you to keep digging into this stuff. Explore the sources for yourselves and decide what you think really happened in Dallas.
You never know. You might uncover something new.
Maybe by putting all these pieces together, questioning what we think we know, and challenging the official stories, we can get closer to the truth, even if it's not what we want to hear.
Exactly. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and remember, sometimes the most important answers are the ones we discover ourselves.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.